Good morning, everybody. It is a great pleasure to be here in my hometown of Socorro, where I'm a third proud generation Socorroan, with my grandma's father, my great grandpa Frank, having grown up alongside the orphans at Real Vista Farms. Later, my grandpa's husband, my grandpa Chewy, would come to the States to the Placero program in the Real Vista Farms. And so it is in this community with such vibrancy and such history that I grew up, and I met the many challenges and obstacles that life throws at you. And it's made me to become who I am, a queer mental health advocate. And in my work, I get to stand alongside our staff, our volunteers, and so many community members who tell their story and share their story of living with a mental health condition. They talk to our community about the darkest days. They talk to our community about how they're overcoming the darkest days right now, how they're supporting a family member who is living with a mental health condition. And so looking at our stories, you see resilience. However, I find myself more and more reflecting on resilience and what resilience really means in our journeys and our way we face traumatic events and how we heal and how we grow. You know, I don't argue the importance of resilience, but I really take a step back and think about the conversations we're having about resilience and how we are injecting that into our everyday lives. And so a quick Google search will take you to the American Psychological Association's definition of resilience, which is successfully adapting and meeting difficult life events and having a positive outcome, and doing so with mental, behavioral flexibility. But what is successful, and what does it mean to really overcome and meet those challenges head on? And what kind of tolerance are we putting in our resilience? And so I think about some of the things I've been through, and one of the first major crises that I experienced when I was in middle school. I remember being in my living room, and I was about 12, with my little sister, who was no older than 4 at the time. And a family member came home, and they were clearly inebriated. It wasn't anything different. It was something I've seen every week for maybe most of my life. However, something was a little different, something was a little off this time. They gave me and my little sister the cash they had in their wallets, which all in all is good. I mean, I had a couple things to splurge on at 12. My 4-year-old sister, I don't know if she even knew how to count her money. But that cash came with a goodbye. My family member made clear that they weren't going to need it anymore, so they were giving it away. It was only when I become a mental health advocate that I realized that was a warning sign. Something was going on. They went upstairs, and luckily my older sister knew something was going on. So after, my family member went into their bedroom on the second story, took off the window screen, hopped on the bed, and prepared to jump. After, all the screaming, all the yelling, and after me going out and yelling for PD to hurry up and get home, they ended up safely behind a cop car on their way to the psychiatric hospital. The next morning, obviously the air in the house is really heavy. They came home. Shout out to my Uncle Mike, who's only with us now in spirit, but was always ready to meet the crises that our families faced. Brought him home, and my family member knocked on my door, hugged me, and apologized. And that was it. We never really talked about it. The only other time I heard them talk about it was in the car, and they were talking to someone on the phone, and they were just really kind of joking about it. And just saying, oops, just lost a little marble. That was it. Nobody told me, maybe that was their way to cope, but nobody told me at 12, hey, this is suicide, this is mental health. We never really talked about it. I went on, a little bit more scared of every weekend, a little bit more scared of every time they were inebriated, because I didn't know when they were going to lose another marble. And I just continued on, and I did well, right? I did well in school. I had great friends. My mom and my sister were there, and we created a closer bond. All in all, I was pretty resilient through it. However, the pain and the wound still stayed with me. And I think about growing up and a little bit later on, when I started having really deep depressive episodes in college. And my method to overcoming it was just not talking about it, just meeting every day as it came. I would wake up, spend a couple minutes over the toilet wanting to vomit, but I couldn't. The anxiety was eating me up, and I just moved on. And I did well in school. I had great friends. I had the support of my family. But every drive home, every night, there was crying. And there was just a lot going on. But all in all, I was really resilient through it all. It would later come in and it would also impact me in my professional career. I would be resilient. I would tolerate it. When go on the road to burning out, to stress, I became numb to the stress. I became numb to the burnout. And so it was in therapy where I really was able to reflect on those challenges and those events that I had gone through and really begin to heal. Because to be resilient, you have had to gone through a traumatic event and taken on some battle scars, taken on some wounds. And it was only years later that I was really addressing those wounds. And, I was so grateful, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the resiliency that's been instilled on me by my mom, my sisters, my friends, my community, and my therapist reminding every week when we're in therapy. But I really, again, had to think back on what that resilient meant if I wasn't healing my wounds and if I wasn't taking care of that. How far was my resiliency going to take me if I wasn't balancing it and looking at the bigger picture? And so that's why when I talk about resilience now, when I work alongside our community, I also talk about the systems of oppression that impact our marginalized communities, and how I was very privileged and how I had those tools, but not everybody's so lucky. And so I ask everybody to take a look at our systems and look at how we can adapt and how we can lend a hand to our marginalized communities, how we can take a look at our individualized resilience and how we look at it as a bigger picture. In our cultures, we have very similarities here in El Paso. Over the past few years, we've had to become resilient because it's been a mean of survival, and I don't doubt that. But why have we become resilient? What has the system done to force us into this resiliency? What has the oppression done to force us to be resilient in order to survive? And the resilience has helped us fight back, but man, does fighting get really tiring. I also think about, how resilience doesn't equate tolerance. I tolerated my environment for so long. I tolerated the crisis for so long. And I let myself tolerate it because I thought, this is this is just me being resilient. I'm just getting through it. But that's not the case. And that's why it's important when we're meeting our challenges, when we're meeting our traumatic events, or when we're helping our youth become resilient, that we also take a step back and say, hey, let's also focus on those wounds you've been through. Because while you've adapted to the change, you haven't healed from whatever you went through. I also think about, how resilience isn't the only emotion that we have to feel. As we become resilient and go through these traumatic events, there's also going to be grief. There's going to be anger. There's going to be sadness. And all of those things can exist at the same time. And it's okay to allow all of those things to exist at the same time. And so I continue my work alongside our wonderful community, our resilient community, and take a look at our conversations at resilience and ensure that we're balancing resilience so we become stronger and better together. Thank you.